This is important, and it's something that I did not do. My name is Elizabeth, and many a year ago, over a decade, close to a decade, over a decade, I don't know, I wrote my first novel. I have since written 6 novels, and I have learned an exponentially large number of things every time I wrote a novel. Going into my first novel, there were some things that I could have known back then that I didn't know that would have helped me enormously, both in finishing the novel and in making it anything that doesn't make me want to cringe when I think about it now. So, this is a list of 11 things that I think would have benefited me to know before starting my first novel all those years ago. Because that novel is terrible. So if you learn these things now, you might be able to prevent your first novel from being as bad as my first novel. Here we go. Number 1. Your first draft is the most important and the least important draft of your story. It's the most important because you have to finish the first draft if you're ever going to write the story. There's no two ways around it. You can't finish a story unless you finish the first draft. If you start trying to revise before you finish the first draft, you're just gonna get stuck. So, your first draft is the most important draft in that it needs to be finished in order for anything else to happen. But it's also the least important draft in that nothing has to be good or right in the first draft in order for your novel to be published and good and readable. The first draft can be terrible, chaos, repetitive, boring, unoriginal, cliche, and everything else that's bad in a novel. But as long as the first draft is finished, then it's perfect. That's all the first draft needs to be. You don't have to have the right characters, the right story, the right setting, the right description, the right words, nothing. You don't have to have anything right in the first draft. It is the least important draft, but it has to exist. You have to finish the first draft. That is the most important thing. You must finish it before you start revising. Number 2. Details are more important than twists. Specific details are the crux of originality, not wild plot twists. A lot of people going into their first novel, me included, thought if I could write just some convoluted, wild, twisty, unpredictable story, then it wouldn't matter if everything else in the story was, things people had seen 1 million times before in every other novel they'd ever read. And that is not true. The only way to be original is to focus on details. Specific details. That is the basis of originality. Don't focus on plot twists or creating crazy plot scenarios. Just focus on details. Specific, small details that you've never seen before in a story. Number 3. Characters are more important than plot. This is similar to number 2, but you need to write about people rather than events. Even if you're writing a story because you came up with, a fabulous plot or setting. It has to be about specific people. Otherwise, nobody will care. You may think, going into your first novel, that your readers are going to care about your characters purely because of the events that surround them in their lives, but it doesn't really work that way. In real life, people might care about someone just because they're in war, or they're being bullied, or they're sick or something, but in fiction, readers do not extend that to the characters. You have to give your readers a reason to care about the characters. And the tragedy or uniqueness of their circumstance rarely does that. Your characters don't have to be likable in order for them to be meaningful to your reader, as long as we understand what drives them and why they're in the story, why the story is happening to them. Then we'll care about whether or not they're successful. Number 4. Revise in layers rather than trying to fix everything all at once. I do approximately 1 million drafts per story. 30 squared drafts. An exponentially increasing number of drafts per story. Some drafts are longer than others, some require more time, some require less time and I can get them done in a weekend. It all just depends. I do big drafts for structure and small drafts for secondary character arcs. Each character gets their own draft, and in each draft I'm only focusing on one thing. I add layers, and I sand down the clunky parts. I'm not trying to do everything all at once. Number 5. Get feedback before submitting. This is important and it's something that I did not do. I would submit my novels, I would get feedback from agents in the form of rejection, and then I'd learn how to make the story better, but it would be too late because the novel would have already been rejected by everyone everywhere on Earth. So don't do what I do. Get feedback on your novel before you submit it for publication. It's also helpful if you can get feedback from several different people, so that you can take a consensus of the opinions, rather than trying to apply everything that everyone says. Some feedback isn't right for your story, but if everyone thinks the middle is boring, then the middle is probably boring. Number 6. Structure helps get you through the first draft. So do writing craft and rules. You may be trying to write the next big thing or something nobody has ever seen before, some cutting-edge new story that only you can create, but that is not going to happen in the first draft, especially of your first novel. And you will never be able to write the next big thing if you are unable to get through a first draft. Structure helps. Beginning, middle, end. Writing craft rules help too. How does this character change? Is the story paced correctly? Does one scene lead to the next? You need a finished draft before you can play with the rules. Otherwise, you'll likely get yourself lost in the middle of your own creation and give up before you ever reach the end. Number 7. Read the whole thing before starting your revision. This is also something that I did not do with my first novel. I would read parts of it and revise parts of it, and then I was just reading and revising in chunks, so then the final product was not anything cohesive, and you don't want to do that. So, read the whole thing before starting your revision. Mark down any places where you are bored, and take note of every place that you start to skim, because those are the boring parts. If you're bored, your reader will be bored. People also always say to read the book out loud before you start your revision. I've never done that, so I can't speak to its effectiveness. My anxiety is too high. I can't listen to myself speak for that long. But you could try. Number 8. If you're struggling to get through the first draft because your characters don't feel real in the story, allow yourself to carry them through the story based purely on archetype. So, for example, you let your bad guy do bad things just because he's bad. And the hero saves the day because that's what heroes do. And the best friend is supportive because that's what best friends do. Then, after you have completed the first draft, you can focus on making your characters real by giving them backstory and motivation and character change and fears and pet peeves and everything else that they need. The first draft really doesn't need all of that. Especially if the reason you're writing a novel is because you had a great idea for a setting or a plot. You might never get yourself through the first draft if you get stuck on the characters. And it's okay if your characters don't develop until the second or third draft. Your first draft does not need everything, everywhere, all at once. Number 9. To avoid melodrama, try asking yourself how you would react to a certain situation, or how you would feel if you saw someone react the way that your characters do. Even if you're not basing your characters off of anyone in real life, asking yourself this can help you catch moments of melodrama. For example, if your character is constantly throwing themselves through doorways, or wailing over pots of boiling stew, you might not catch that as melodrama when you're reading it as words, but if you step back and think, have I ever once thrown myself through a doorway? What would I think if I saw someone wailing over a pot of stew? And if you feel uncomfortable, that means it's probably melodramatic. Number 10. If you get stuck, skip it. Getting stuck is often an indicator that your story has taken a wrong turn. Rather than powering through and forcing yourself to write through block, I like to just skip ahead to the next scene that I know will be in the story, even if it's significantly ahead in the plot line of the story. Just skip to it. That way, in the future, if those two scenes that you've written, the one that caused the block and the one that you knew was going to be in the story, if those two scenes don't logically connect to each other, or if there is no logical progression, then you can more easily backtrack to a scene before the blocked scene that will lead the story towards the new scene direction that you want to go. If you try to power through, you can end up writing a lot more stuff and spending a lot more time on things that end up getting cut out of the story anyway. And it will be way harder to figure out where you went wrong and how far back you need to go before you can get the story back on track. So, if you get stuck, skip it. Number 11. The next novel will always be better than the previous one. My advice would be to always finish every first draft, but don't get hung up on revising to perfection. People always say, don't start a new story until you finish the story you're currently working on. And that's true, that's good advice. It's easy to be the person that only writes beginnings of stories, and you want to finish the first draft. Always finish the first draft before moving on. You have to finish a full first draft of a novel to really learn from it. But once you finish the first draft, it's also easy to get so hung up on revision that you're stuck revising your first novel for years without making much improvement, either to the story or to yourself as a writer. And the truth is that your second novel will always be better than your first, and your third novel will be better than your second. You have to know when to table a novel. Sometimes stories just don't work. Or, sometimes, you're just not ready to write the story with your current skills as a writer. But if you feel like this is a story that you need to tell, and that it can work, but it's just not there yet, rather than revising, for all eternity, you can always table the story and come back to it in the future, after having written several other novels, grown as a writer. After the next few novels are completed, you'll know so much more about storytelling and how to write a story that you can come back to this first novel and really make it what you envision it to be. You can apply your new knowledge of storytelling to your old story, but you won't get those skills or that knowledge unless you're able to recognize when a novel needs to be tabled so that you can write something else and grow.